As of today, we are 2 weeks out from unleavened bread. And as we heard, especially on the first day, there's two components to unleavened bread. And the first is removing the leaven, and then the second is replacing it with something else. And of course, replacing that with unleavened bread. And of course, that means, and it's symbolizes removing sin from our life and then replacing it with righteousness. But on the last day of unleavened bread, we were in Boston. The pastor there, Paul Suckling, asked a very good question. He said, what is the percentage chance you would put on whatever it was you looked at in your life ahead of Passover this year, that will be the exact same thing that you were addressing next year? So essentially nothing changed. All the things you were working on this year are going to be the exact same things that you've identified in your life you have to work on in 2020. Or to say it another way, how do we know, now that unleavened bread is over, what do we need to do to stay in a spiritually unleavened state? And the answer to that is, well, there are a lot of things, but I'd like to focus on one key today that is critical in not allowing sin back into our life. So during the sermon time, what I'd like to do is create an analogy with a king that the Bible said was the greatest king that Judah ever had. Now, when we hear that, first thing I think of is David, but it's not David. And then second, we've heard messages on Hezekiah, but it's not Hezekiah, it's someone else. Let's turn over to 2 Kings 23. And we'll see that this man, who is Josiah, the greatest king that Judah ever had, he did exactly what we did during unleavened bread. He removed all of the leaven, the sin, from Judah. He replaced it with something else, with righteousness for the entire nation. But this man made a critical mistake. There was something else he didn't do. It cost him his life, but not just his life. When he died, a sequence of events began that caused Judah to go directly into captivity in just a period of a few short years. If you have a placeholder in your Bible, we'll be looking at 2 Kings 23, and then we'll also be looking at the parallel account in 2 Chronicles. But it says of Josiah, 2 Kings 23, verse 25, now before him there was no king like him, who turned to the Lord with all his heart, with all his soul, with all his might, according to all the law of Moses, nor after him did any arise. It says here, the greatest king that Judah ever had. And we'll look at his life today during the sermon time essentially in three phases. And that will be a direct analogy to what we've just come out of with Passover and unleavened bread. Now, phase one, similar for us, going up in the days and the weeks ahead of Passover and the beginning of unleavened bread, we get the leaven out of our homes. Josiah did exactly that with Judah. He removed the sin and pagan worship from Judah. Let's look and see just how bad Judah was, how corrupt and how rife it was with pagan worship over in 2 Kings 21, verse 2. And we read about Josiah's father, Manasseh. Manasseh's father was Hezekiah, and of course Hezekiah implemented all these righteous reforms. But as soon as Hezekiah died and Manasseh took over, look how quickly Judah plunged back into pagan idolatry. Talking of Manasseh, 2 Kings 21, verse 2, he did evil in the sight of the Lord, according to the abominations of the nations which the Lord had cast out before the children of Israel. And think about this. Hezekiah had torn all these things down. Manasseh immediately builds them back up. He rebuilt the high places, which Hezekiah, his father, had destroyed. He raised up altars for Baal. He made a wooden image, as Ahab, the king of Israel, done, and he worshipped all the host of heaven and served them. His father had been so loyal to God, yet his son worshipped the entire host of heaven. But it gets worse. He implemented child sacrifice down in verse 6. It says, also, he made his sons pass through the fire. And that's something we've talked about before. They would sacrifice young babies to Molech. They would build this huge bronze statue of Molech. They would heat it from the inside with a huge fire. Molech had his arms out like this, and they would put the baby on these scalding hot arms, and then the priest would beat the drum so the parents couldn't hear the screams of the children. He reinstituted child sacrifice and sacrificed his very own sons. Verse 7, he set a carved image of Ashtaroth, the fertility goddess. that he had made, in the house of which the Lord had said to David and to Solomon his son, in this house and in Jerusalem, which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel, I will put my name forever. He put a pagan symbol in the middle of the temple. So when you think about it, this is the society or the state of paganism, the state of leavening, for lack of a better term, that Josiah found himself born into. Let's turn to the parallel account in 2 Chronicles 34 in verse 1. Judah was just about as full of leaven as it could possibly be. It was completely corrupted. We see Manasseh's son, Ammon, was just as corrupt as Manasseh was. And then Josiah is born. 2 Kings 34 and verse 1. Josiah was 8 years old when he became king, and he reigned 31 years in Jerusalem. And he did what was right in the sight of the Lord and walked in the ways of his father David. He did not turn aside to the right hand or the left. And in the 8th year of his reign, when he was still young, he began what we'll call the de-leavening process of Judah. He began to seek the God of his father David, and in his 12th year, he began to purge Judah and Jerusalem of the high places, the wooden images, the carved images, the molded images. They broke down the altars of the Baals in his presence. And the incense altars, which were above them, he cut down. The wooden images and the carved images and the molded images he broke into pieces. He made dust of them and scattered it on the graves of those who had sacrificed to them. So he desecrated the graves of the people who had been offering sacrifices to these images. Verse 5, he also burned the bones of the priests of their altars and cleansed Judah and Jerusalem. So he did in the cities of Manasseh and Ephraim and Simeon, and as far as Naphtali, and all around with axes. Now remember, the northern 10 tribes had already been carried away into captivity. Naphtali was at the top of that. It was well north of Judah. So Josiah was so convicted, he didn't just de-leaven Judah, he went all the way up into the old territory of Israel. So more than just Judah. We won't read the parallel account in 2 Kings 23, but it goes into much more detail on all these reforms that Josiah put into place to rid Judah of pagan worship, of Baal worship, of Ashtaroth worship, and all the host of heaven. Actually, Judah was still so polluted, they had a hill dating from the time of King Solomon, actually called the Mount of Corruption. And we read in the Bible that Solomon built that for his wives that were Sidonian and Moabite wives, and his wives from Ammon. And that still existed. Josiah burned all of that to the ground. And something that I find encouraging, especially when what I'm looking at in myself this past Passover was the same thing I saw the year before, or the year before that. Notice in 2 Chronicles 34, verse 8, it says, in the 18th year of his reign, so he would have been 26, when he had purged the land and the temple, he sent Shaphan the son, we won't read the rest of it. Remember, he started purging the land when he was 20. It took 6 years to get all the leaven out of Judah. And I find that encouraging with me when I'm still dealing with some of the same struggles and things that I want to put out of my life. 2, 3, 5 years, often it takes longer. So to summarize phase 1 of what Josiah did, is he purged the entire land and nation of pagan worship. He took the idols and the images and the false gods and he burned them to the ground. And he did exactly what we do again in the days leading up to the days of unleavened bread, is we identify what's wrong, the sin, and we get rid of it. But as we know, just removing the leaven out of our homes, and of course removing it out of our lives, isn't enough. We need to replace it with something else. And that's exactly what Josiah did. So phase 2 was noting that Josiah didn't just remove the pagan worship and idolatry, he replaced it with the worship that God commanded, just as we replaced leavened bread with unleavened bread and sin with righteousness. Let's turn to 2 Chronicles 34 and verse 14. So what had happened is there was money in the temple. They were taking this money out of the temple to pay the workers who were refurbishing the temple. And when they brought the money, that was brought out of the house of the Lord, Hilkiah, the high priest, found the book of the law given to Moses. Now, most commentators will speculate that this was probably just Deuteronomy. It could have been actually the first 5 books of the law. Some even believe this could have been the original copy that Moses had recorded, and it had been kept for safekeeping in the temple. Bottom line is they found it, and no one knew what this book was. Verse 15, Hilkiah answered and said to Shaphan the scribe, I have found the book of the law in the house of the Lord. And Hilkiah gave the book to Shaphan. Shaphan carried the book to the king, and he brought him word, saying, all that was committed to your servants they are doing. They have gathered the money that was found in the house of the Lord. They've delivered it into the hand of the overseers and the workmen. And then Shaphan the scribe told the king, saying, Hilkiah the priest has given me a book. And Shaphan read it before the king, and thus it happened, when the king heard the words of the law, he immediately tore his clothes. It wasn't enough that he had got rid of all the pagan idol worship. He realized that wasn't enough, that God wanted more, and instead of just not doing this, he also commanded Judah to do this. And his immediate reaction was he knew how wrong he and the nations were, and he immediately tore his clothes. And notice what he did, verse 29. The king sent and gathered all the elders of Judah and Jerusalem. He went up to the house of the Lord with all the men of Judah and the inhabitants, the priests and the Levites, all the people, great and small. So this was so important, he gathered the entire nation, everyone. And he read in their hearing all the words of the book of the covenant, which had been found in the house of the Lord. The king stood in his place, and he made a covenant before the Lord, to follow the Lord, to keep his commandments and his testimonies and his statute with all his heart, with all his soul, and to perform the words and covenant that were written in the book. And he made all who were present in Jerusalem and Benjamin take a stand. Or as the Tanakh translates this, he made them all obligated to follow the same thing. He instituted this covenant with God before the people on a national basis. And the people did it. They responded, because we read in the next verse, so the inhabitants of Jerusalem did according to the covenant of God, the God of their fathers. So again, much like we practice leading up to the days of unleavened bread, not only did Josiah remove the leaven from the land, but he replaced it with obedience to God. And he also replaced it with the keeping of God's holy days. And that's really a hallmark of Israel and Judah, that anytime there was repentance on a national level, one of the very first things that occurred was they reinstituted the keeping of the holy days. You think about Hezekiah's time when he took over for Ahaz. Ahaz was probably the most evil king that Israel ever had. One of the very first things they did was what? They reinstituted the holy days. They kept the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and they kept it with so much joy, they kept it for another 7 days. Or when the remnant of Judah was allowed to return to Jerusalem, coming out of Babylonian captivity. What do we read about in Ezra and Nehemiah? The very first things they did were reinstituted the holy days. And as we see with Josiah, he did the exact same thing. Chapter 35 and verse 1. Now Josiah kept a Passover to the Lord in Jerusalem. They slaughtered the Passover lambs on the 14th day of the first month. He set for the priests and their duties and encouraged them for the services of the house of the Lord. And he said to the Levites who taught all Israel, who were holy to the Lord, put the holy ark in the house which Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel, built. And then he said something interesting here that leads to some speculation. It shall no longer be a burden on your shoulders. Now serve the Lord your God and his people. And that's led some commentators to wonder, in times where you had a bad king or an evil king, did that mean the priests would hide the ark so that it wouldn't be lost? Because now he's telling them it won't be a burden on your shoulders anymore. Bring it back into the temple, because again, the temple had been refurbished. And then we read something important, and it speaks to the heart of one of the reasons why Josiah was called the greatest king that Judah ever had. And there's a lesson for us. When you read this, ask yourself, is Josiah serving his people, or did he expect the people to serve him? Verse 7, Josiah gave the lay people lambs and young goats from the flock, all for Passover offerings, who were present, to the number of 30,000, as well as 3,000 cattle. They were from the king's possessions. And the leaders gave willingly to the people, to the priests, and to the Levites. And isn't that one of the hallmarks of righteous leadership, is the king gave from his possessions to the people, I assume who couldn't afford it or who needed it, not expecting the people to give to him. And remember, that's what split Israel in the first place, because under Solomon, there was such a heavy taxation on the people, so essentially the people funding what Solomon wanted to do and build, that remember, they begged Solomon's son, Rehoboam, saying, please give us some tax relief so that, we can have our lives. And what did Rehoboam say? He said, my little finger shall be thicker than my father's waist, meaning you think you had it bad from a tax perspective under Solomon? Wait till you see what I'm going to do. And you contrast that with what we read about Josiah here. And of course, Christ was the ultimate example of that, God in the flesh coming down and doing what he did. And especially as we commemorate on Passover, he didn't wash just 11 disciples' feet. He washed all 12, including Judas, knowing full well exactly what Judas had done and was about to do. So what an example of being a servant. Verse 16, so all the service of the Lord was prepared the same day to keep the Passover and offer burnt offerings on the altar of the Lord, according to the command of King Josiah. And the children of Israel who were present kept the Passover at that time and the feast of unleavened bread for 7 days. There had been no Passover kept in Israel like that since the days of Samuel the prophet. Not with David, not with Solomon, not with Hezekiah. Going back roughly, if our numbers are right, roughly 370 years. That's when Samuel had died versus when Josiah kept this Passover. I went into Google to find out what was happening 370 or 380 years ago, and that's when Galileo was defending himself against the Roman Church when he said that the earth isn't the center of the universe. That's a long time ago, but that's how long it had been since a Passover was kept with this much joy. So to recap phase 2, we've seen that Josiah, after he removed the pagan worship from the land, he replaced it with something else. He reinstituted obedience to God's law and holy days, and the nation kept the greatest Passover in nearly 400 years. And in keeping with the analogy, that's what we've done, ending 2 weeks ago. We replaced the leaven in our lives with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. So, what now? Did Josiah and Judah just live happily ever after? I could cut the sermon off after 17 minutes. Tony would like that. I purposely left something out. Let's go back to 2 Kings 22 and read the parallel account. In verse 11, when Josiah heard the words of the book of the law, and he tore his clothes, but this account tells us he did one other thing. 2 Kings 22 and verse 11. He did something that we all in this room need to be doing now that unleavened bread is over. It happened when the king heard the words of the book of the law that he tore his clothes. We read that in Chronicles. But then notice what he did. The exact moment after he had torn his clothes, he commanded his people to do something. The king commanded Hilkiah the priest and several of the others, Shaphan the scribe, Isaiah, a servant of the king, verse 13, saying, go inquire of the Lord for me and for the people and for all of Judah. Josiah didn't think he could go directly to God, and we'll see something interesting on that later. He took his servants and he said, go and talk to the prophet and find out what God's will is. Find out what I'm supposed to do. Concerning the words of the book that have been found, for great is the wrath of the Lord that is aroused against us, because our fathers have not obeyed the words of this book to do according to all that was written concerning us. So when he realized, despite all these righteous reforms, the magnitude of how far both he as king, but the people in general were removed from God, the very first thing he did is he went to God to inquire what his will was and what he should do. Verse 14, so Hilkiah the priest, Ahikam, Achbor, Shaphan, Isaiah went to Huldah the prophetess, the wife of Shulem the son of Tikvah, the son of Harhas, keeper of the wardrobe. She dwelt in Jerusalem in the second quarter. And notice what Huldah the prophetess said. She said, you did the exact right thing by coming to seek God's will. In verse 18 it says, but as for the king of Judah who sent you. So again, the point being, Josiah sent them to inquire of the Lord. In this matter you shall speak to him, thus says the Lord God of Israel, concerning the words which you have heard, because your heart was tender, and you humbled yourself before the Lord when you heard what I spoke against this place and against its inhabitants, that they would become a desolation and a curse. You tore your clothes and you wept. So understand his attitude. He tore his clothes. He realized how much sin both he and the nation were committing. He cried. In verse 19 it says his heart was tender and he humbled himself. And she said, the things that you read about in the book, these penalties, they won't come upon you. So they brought word back to the king. Again, the point being, Josiah immediately sought God's will, and he did it with a humility and with a tender heart. And that's the point I'd like to focus on today, that now that we're past unleavened bread, how do we stay in an unleavened state? Yes, we put the leaven out, we replaced it with something else. It's so easy to say, but as we'll see in a minute, it's hard to do, to consistently seek God's will on a daily basis with humility and having a tender heart. And why is that hard? Well, for a couple of reasons. When times are good, and when we have relative peace, and maybe we don't have a number of trials in our life at any moment, it's easy to stop daily seeking God's will because A, we assume we already know what it is, or B, even if we do seek God's will, we're actually hoping, not in an objective manner, but we're hoping whatever God's will is will reinforce what we, as carnal people, want to have happen in the first place. Let's fast forward 13 years in Josiah's life. 13 years of peace, 13 years of worshiping God, of keeping the holy days, of on a national basis living in a state of obedience. Things are pretty good. And notice what happens with Josiah. Let's go to 2 Chronicles 25 and verse 20. It says, so after all this, all these reforms, all these things that he's done, after all this, when Josiah had prepared the temple, Necho, the king of Egypt, came up to fight at Carchemish by the Euphrates, and Josiah went out against him. Now, it's easy to read over that, but there's a big problem that doesn't make sense. Carchemish is nowhere close to Judah. It's hundreds, probably 250 to 300 miles north of Judah. Why would Josiah go way out of his way to fight a Pharaoh who didn't want to have anything to do with attacking Judah in the first place? Something here is amiss. And just for background's sake, remember Assyria 100 years earlier, the Assyrian Empire was the one that carried the northern 10 tribes captive. They had been a superpower, but now their power was crumbling. And the Babylonians, that was the rising power now. Egypt and Assyria were allies. So what was happening is Pharaoh was going up to help Assyria fight against the Babylonians. And this had nothing to do with Judah. But verse 21, we see Josiah went out against him. And notice what Pharaoh Necho said to Josiah. But he, Pharaoh, sent messengers to him, meaning Josiah, and says, what have I to do with you, king of Judah? I have not come out against you this day, but against the house with which I have a war. So Pharaoh's saying, Josiah, this is not your fight. I don't want to have anything to do with you. Why are you trying to fight me 200 or 300 miles away from your northern border? And then notice what he goes on to say. For God, and notice you here is talking about the God of Josiah, essentially saying, your God commanded me to make haste or to hurry. Refrain from meddling with God, who is with me, lest he destroys you. Now, carnally, just for a minute, because I'm sure Josiah, he was human like the rest of us, I'm guessing he may have been a little angry at this point, because he says, you are a pagan king, you are the Pharaoh of Egypt. I have had righteous religious reforms for 13 years. My nation has turned to God with their entire heart. I have turned to God with my entire heart. We've rid the nation of idolatry, and now you are telling me about my God, and that if I don't do what you say, my God is going to destroy me? It's possible he got a little angry and got a little arrogant, and I'm guessing he didn't believe that his God was talking to Pharaoh. He assumed he knew what was going on. Verse 22, nevertheless, Josiah would not turn his face from Necho, but he disguised himself so that he might fight with him, and did not heed the words of Necho, and then notice what it says next, from the mouth of God. So he came to fight in the valley of Megiddo. Josiah, the most righteous king that Judah ever had, assumed there is no way that my God would be using Pharaoh. But notice what else didn't happen. Remember when he went to Huldah 13 years earlier? What did Josiah not do here? He didn't go to Jeremiah. He didn't go to any of the other prophets. He didn't go back to Huldah saying, God, should I go up against Pharaoh? It appears, and we don't know why he wanted to fight Pharaoh 200 miles away from his territory, but he was spoiling for a fight. And this man who sought God's will 13 years earlier, when this book of the law was given to him, he ripped his clothes, he sought him with a tender heart, here isn't seeking God's will. He is doing what he wants to do. Let's hold your finger here and turn back to Numbers 27, verse 18. It was not Josiah's prerogative to fight who he wanted to fight, when he wanted to fight them. That was supposed to come from God, just as we see God giving this instruction to Moses about Joshua. Numbers 27, verse 18, the context here is Moses is about to die. God tells him, give Joshua some of your authority. He will be your replacement going forward. But notice what he specifically tells Moses to tell Joshua as it relates to seeking God's will versus making up his mind on what Joshua wants to do, or assuming he knows what God wants him to do. The Lord said to Moses, take Joshua the son of Nun, a man in whom is the Spirit, and lay your hand on him. Have him stand before Eleazar the priest and the entire assembly, and commission him in their presence. Give him some of your authority, so the whole Israelite community will obey him. So Moses here is giving Joshua some of his authority. The entire nation is going to obey him. But notice what comes next. Is he saying Joshua is the man going forward so he can decide to do what he wants when he wants to do it? He, speaking of Joshua, is to stand before Eleazar the priest, who will obtain decisions for him by inquiring of the Urim before the Lord. Even though Joshua was the leader of the entire nation of Israel, it wasn't up to Joshua to decide what to do or who to fight when. He was to go to the priest, and the priest was to inquire directly of God and find out what God wanted, not what Joshua wanted. Going on, it says, and at his command, so at the priest's command, both Joshua and the entire community of Israelites will go out, and at his command, they will come in. That is what God wanted the rules to be for Israel at that time when they were conquering the promised land. They would seek and find out what God's will was, and then they would do it. Clearly, Josiah did not remember the lesson from 13 years prior. And going back to the story of Josiah, it wasn't his prerogative to decide if Judah should or shouldn't go attack Egypt. He should have sought God's will. And as I said, Jeremiah was on the scene. Habakkuk was on the scene. Naaman was alive at that time, or go back to Huldah, but he didn't. The greatest king that Judah ever had assumed for himself what God's will was. He thought there was no way God would work through the Egyptian Pharaoh. And that cost him his life, as we're about to see, and led to a series of events that caused Judah to cease to exist as a nation because he didn't seek God's will. He thought he knew what it was. 2 Chronicles 35, verse 23, and the archers, so the Egyptian archers, shot King Josiah, and the king said to his servants, take me away, for I am severely wounded. And his servants before him took him out of the chariot and put him in the second chariot that they had, and they brought him to Jerusalem. And so he died, and was buried in one of the tombs of his fathers, and all Judah and Jerusalem mourned for Josiah. Jeremiah also lamented for Josiah, and to this day, all the singing men and the singing women speak of Josiah in their lamentations. As bad as that was, as rash as that decision was to choose to do what he wanted to do, as opposed to going and seeking God's will, it gets worse. Notice what happens next. Jehoahaz, his son, becomes king, but he only reigns for 3 months. And why is that? Because now Pharaoh Necho, is angry after telling Josiah, I don't have a problem with you. I don't want to fight you. And Josiah still fought him. Notice what happens next, and notice what the consequences for the entire nation are. 2 Kings 23 and verse 31. Jehoahaz was 23 years old when he became king, and he reigned 3 months in Jerusalem. And why was that only 3 months? Go down to verse 33. Now Pharaoh Necho. So Necho had been fighting against the Babylonians for the last 3 months, and he was angry, and on his way back he came right down and went through Judah and Jerusalem. Pharaoh Necho put him in prison at Riblah in the land of Hamath, that he might not reign in Jerusalem. And he imposed on the land a tribute of 100 talents of silver and a talent of gold. Pharaoh Necho made Eliakim, the son of Josiah, king in the place of Josiah, and he changed his name to Jehoiakim. And again, showing how in charge he was, he said, you're not going to be king, your brother's going to be king, but I'm going to change his name, and I'm taking you back to Egypt with me. And Pharaoh took Jehoahaz and went to Egypt, and he died there. So not only did Josiah's failure to seek God's will cost him his own life, it cost him the life of his son, who was taken away after being king for only 3 months and ended up dying in Egypt. But it began a series of events that doomed the entire nation. If you have a New King James Bible, you'll see the chapter heading for chapter 24 says, Judah overrun by enemies. And of course, shortly thereafter, it was taken captive. Josiah went from seeking God's will with a tender heart and humility to not seeking his will at all. And when I read that, there's a lesson for me that if the greatest king that Israel and the nation of Judah ever had could have a case of spiritual drift after this incredible time of national repentance, keeping God's laws, learning about his way, reinstituting the holy days. Whatever happened over that 13-year period, Josiah went from seeking God's will to doing what he wanted. And if that can happen to him, it can happen to me. Let's turn over to Matthew chapter 6 and verse 9 as it relates to seeking God's will, because I think there's a question that needs to be asked. Christ's disciples came to him and they said, we don't know how to pray, or we don't know how we should be praying, so teach us how to pray. And of course, Christ responded with this model prayer. And he said, in this manner, therefore, pray, our Father in heaven, hallowed or holy be your name. And then notice what the very next thing they're to pray for is, your kingdom come and your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And of course, the next sentence is, give us this day our daily bread. And so by extension, that means that we're supposed to pray for our bread every day. We should also be praying every day that God's will be done. But the question I would ask is, why did Jesus Christ tell us to pray on a daily basis that God's will be done? Does God need our help? If not enough of us pray that God's will be done, does that mean God's will won't be done? Well, of course, that's silly. God is God, and his will be done regardless of whether I pray for it or not. So the question is then, if God's will is going to be done, because God is God, why should I pray daily for it? Well, one reason I would submit is that maybe God doesn't need my help, but rather by praying daily for God's will, it helps me. It helps us. And we'll see praying daily for God's will versus just assuming, I've been doing this for so long, I've been attending church for 45 years, I kind of have it figured out, I think, what God wants and what he doesn't want. By praying daily for God's will, it does two things for us. First, if we do it with humility and with a tender heart, it allows us to recognize what God's will is, because God's will is not always easily recognized. Clearly it wasn't with Josiah. He didn't even allow for the possibility that God had talked to Pharaoh and did in fact want Pharaoh to hurry up and go fight against the Babylonians. So first, it helps us realize and recognize God's will. And then secondly, perhaps this is the more difficult one, it helps us be willing to submit to it. So as we begin to wrap up, I'd like to briefly focus on these 2 points and expand them, that of recognizing God's will and then being willing to submit to it. The first one, on recognizing God's will, the human mind in and of itself often is incapable of recognizing God's will, because God's will and his way and his mind is so far beyond anything in the human realm. One scripture on this over in Isaiah 55 and verse 8. And obviously the Holy Spirit, being paired with our mind, can help us tremendously. But versus the carnal mind and the human mind, it's often incapable of recognizing God's will. Isaiah 55 and verse 8, God inspired Isaiah to record, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts." So if God's thoughts are not my thoughts, and I'm making assumptions on what God's will is without the power of the Holy Spirit, I will be wrong. "Nor are your ways my ways," says the Lord. "For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." And maybe the example of Josiah is one of the greatest examples of this, that what Josiah's will was and what he assumed God's will was did not actually end up being God's will. God did in fact speak to Pharaoh Necho, and he did in fact tell him to hurry up and go fight, and Josiah, in his human mind and his human way of thinking, didn't even allow for that possibility. And so he did what he wanted to do, and of course we know what the consequences were, both for him and for the entire nation. So point number one is, by daily praying for God's will to be done, it helps us recognize it. And as we've seen, to the human carnal mind, that is not something that comes natural. But the second point of focusing daily on God's will teaches us, once we recognize it, to be willing to submit to it. And that is not easy. I'll quote Romans 8, verse 7 for you. I think we all know it well. It says, "The carnal mind is enmity against God." That's not really a word we use much now. So many translations say the carnal mind is hostile towards God. Essentially, the carnal mind wants to fight what God wants to do. And if you think about the course of human history, under the leadership of Satan the devil, that's essentially what we've seen time after time after time. What happened in the Garden of Eden? You can eat of any tree you want except this one. What did Adam and Eve do? They ate that one. After the flood, what did God tell humanity? It said, "You have dominion over the animals. You don't need to worry about it. Go spread over the earth and repopulate it." And what was the first thing they did? They said, "No, we're going to go make cities and put up walls because we're scared of the animals." They did exactly the opposite of what God told them. It even happened with Israel. What did God say? Once you get to the promised land, this is what you can't do. Do not intermarry with the people of the nations, because they'll lead you astray and you will serve their gods. And whether it's Solomon or the very first thing we read about the Jews doing when they returned in Ezra and Nehemiah to the land of Judah, the very first thing they did is, even the priests and the people, they intermarried with the pagan nations around them. And we see that time and time and time again. If this is God's will, this is what man wants to do. There's perhaps no better example of this in Jeremiah 42. Let's turn to Jeremiah 42. And again, the second point being, once we recognize what God's will is, by praying daily for it, it helps us to be willing to submit to it. So the context here is, there's just a remnant of the Jews left in Judah, and they're scared. The Babylonians are coming, and they don't know what to do. Their two options are either to stay and hope the Babylonians don't kill them all, or to flee to Egypt. And so on the surface, they do exactly the right thing, and they go to the prophet to inquire what is God's will. Jeremiah 42 and verse 1, it says, "Now the captains of the forces, from the least to the great," skipping down to verse 2, "they said to Jeremiah the prophet, 'Please, let our petition be acceptable to you, and pray for us to the Lord your God, that all this remnant, since we are left but a few of many, as you can see, that the Lord your God may show us the way.'" So essentially say, Jeremiah, please pray to God that he will show us what to do, that we will find out what his will is, in which we should walk and what we should do. So on the surface here, they're doing the right thing. They're going to seek God's will, and as we'll see in a minute, they say, whatever God tells us. If he says go left, we'll go left. If he says go right, we'll go right, and we'll do it. Jeremiah the prophet said to them, I have heard. Indeed, I will pray to the Lord your God according to your works, and it shall be that whatever the Lord answers you, I will declare it to you, and I will keep nothing back from you. Again, on if they should stay in the land or if they should flee to Egypt. And notice what they said to Jeremiah. So they said to Jeremiah, let the Lord be a true and faithful witness between us. So essentially calling on the name of God to be a witness to what they were about to say. And they said, if we do not do according to everything which the Lord your God sends us by you, whether it is pleasing or displeasing, we will obey the voice of the Lord our God to whom we send you, that it may be well with us, and when we obey the voice of the Lord your God. And this is the exact right thing they should do. You're seeking God's will, and then you say whatever his will is, whether that's the answer I was hoping for or that's not the answer I was hoping for. So it happened after 10 days, the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah. Verse 8, and he called all the people, verse 9, and he said, thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, whom you sent me to present your petition before him. If you will if you will still remain in the land, then I will build you and I will not pull you down. I will plant you and not pluck you up. For I will relent concerning the disaster which I have brought upon you. Verse 11, do not be afraid of the king of Babylon, of whom you are afraid. Don't be afraid of him, says the Lord, for I am with you to save you and deliver you from his hand, and I will show you mercy, that he may have mercy on you and cause you to return to your own land. So they said, please tell us what to do. 10 days later, Jeremiah comes back and he says, the Lord says, stay in the land. If you stay in the land and obey me, you don't have to fear the king of Babylon. And for the sake of time, we won't read verses 13 through 19, but he said, if you decide to go to Egypt, you will all die. So going down to verse 20, notice what Jeremiah says to the people. When they came with this petition, we find out they weren't legitimate. They weren't truly seeking God's will. They were seeking reinforcement of what they wanted in the first place, their will. Verse 20, for you, says Jeremiah, were hypocrites in your hearts. And you compare that to what was said about Josiah, where he came to God seeking his will with humility and tenderness of hearts. Here, Jeremiah calls this group hypocrites of hearts. When you sent me to the Lord your God, saying, pray for us to the Lord our God, and according to all that the Lord says, so declare to us, and we will do it. They came under the pretense to Jeremiah saying, we are seeking God's will, but they weren't. They were seeking validation from God of their will. And there's a lesson for us in that. And notice what they said now. Remember before, they seemed to be humble. Chapter 43, verse 1. Now it happened when Jeremiah had stopped speaking to all the people, all the words of the Lord their God, for which the Lord their God had sent to them all these words. Azariah, the son of Hoshai, Jehonan, the son of Kara, and all the proud men spoke. Where did these suddenly proud men come from? Before, they were coming with humility, and now everyone's talking at once, and we find out there's pride. And they said to Jeremiah, the prophet of God, you speak falsely. The Lord our God has not sent you to say, do not go to Egypt or to dwell there. Going down to verse 4, all of these people and the captains of the forces would not obey the voice of the Lord to remain in the land of Judah. And what did they do? They did what they wanted to do. Verse 7, they went to the land of Egypt, for they did not obey the voice of the Lord, and they went as far as Taphanes. God called these people hypocrites in their heart because they used the guise of seeking God's will to actually hopefully get a rubber stamp for what they wanted. And I think this very much speaks to Proverbs 16, verse 25. We won't turn there. It says, there is a way that seems right to man. In this case, going to Egypt was the way that seemed right to them, but the end thereof is death. And it's not recorded what happened to this group of Jews who went, but I'm pretty sure that they suffered exactly what God said they would, and that would be to die. So point number 2 is that once we recognize what God's will is, we must be willing to submit to it, even if it's contrary to what we were hoping God's will would be, if it's contrary to what we want. Let's turn to Matthew chapter 26 and verse 39. On the subject of submitting to God's will once we recognize it. This is the last night of Christ's life. He knows that it's the last night of his life, and he knows what he's about to physically endure. He's praying so hard that literal drops of blood are falling from his face. Matthew 26 and verse 39. Christ went a little further, and he fell on his face and prayed, saying, "O my Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me." So essentially saying, God, this is what I would really like. This is what my preference is, because he knew all that he would have to physically suffer. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will. He came up to the disciples and found them sleeping. He said to Peter, "What, could you not watch with me 1 hour? Watch and pray, lest you fall into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." And again, a second time, he went away and he prayed, saying, "O my Father, if this cup cannot pass away from me unless I drink it, your will be done." What an incredible example that the one who was truly God in the flesh, instead of focusing on his will, instead of focusing on his well-being and on his comfort, knowing he was about to be tortured, knowing he was about to be executed and die, his singular focus, the last night of his life, and actually throughout all of his life, was one on knowing what God's will was, and then 2, submitting to it. If we ask the question, why did Jesus Christ give up his divinity and come to earth? What would the answer be? We could say to pay the penalty for sin, and that would be right. We could say to begin the church, and that would be correct. We could say to proclaim the gospel, and that would also be right. But Christ actually gave us an answer to that himself over in John chapter 6 and verse 38 on why it was that he gave up his divinity and came down to earth to do all that he did. John chapter 6 and verse 38. Christ says, "For I have come down from heaven." The reason I came, the reason I did this was not to do my own will, but the will of him who sent me. First, to recognize what that will was, and then secondly, to submit to it. So what have we learned? Josiah, the greatest king that Judah ever had, de-leavened Judah. He replaced that leaven in the sinful pagan idol worship with unleavened bread. And he sought God's will in the process. He said, "God, we have sinned. What should we do?" But after 13 years, and we don't know why, maybe he got comfortable, maybe he was coasting, he apparently stopped seeking God's will, and certainly not with the humility and tenderness of heart he had shown 13 years prior. Maybe he assumed that he already knew what God's will was. Or maybe Josiah just wanted to do what Josiah wanted to do. As a result of that, of not seeking God's will in the incident with Pharaoh Necho, it got him killed and initiated Judah being taken into captivity. There's a lesson for all of us now that we're 2 weeks past the Feast of Unleavened Bread. We got the leaven out, physically from our homes and hopefully spiritually from our lives. And we replaced that leavened bread with unleavened bread physically and spiritually with the unleavened bread of righteousness and truth. But as the legacy of Josiah teaches us, a key to remaining in an unleavened state as we go forward for the balance of the year is to seek God's will and to seek it on a daily basis with humility and tenderness of heart. So let's ensure we pray daily for God's will to be done in our lives, both to recognize it, but also to be willing to submit to it.